Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that nearly 20% of your country's wealth had vanished overnight. Banks would panic, markets would collapse, politicians would blame one another, entire industries would fight to survive. Now imagine something even more disturbing. What if that wealth wasn't stored in gold, or factories, or railroads? What if it was people? That was the reality of the United States in 1860. Long before the first cannon fired at Fort Sumter, before Abraham Lincoln became America's most famous president, before the Confederacy even existed, the nation had already built one of the largest financial systems in the world around a single institution: slavery. Not simply as forced labor, not only as a brutal moral injustice, but as an asset, one that banks accepted as collateral, insurance companies protected, investors depended upon, and governments quietly built policies around. For decades, Americans argued over tariffs, railroads, Western territories, states' rights, and the authority of the federal government. These debates appeared unrelated, but beneath every political battle lay the same uncomfortable truth. Each side was fighting to protect an economic future that could not coexist with the other. The Civil War did not suddenly erupt because one election went the wrong way. Nor did it begin with a single speech, a single law, or a single battle. It began the moment the United States tried to build one nation upon two completely different economic foundations, one driven by industrial capitalism, the other by plantation slavery. And once those systems began competing for the same territory, the same political power, and the same future, conflict became increasingly impossible to avoid. Today, we're going to follow that story from the beginning, not from the battlefield, but from the balance sheet. Because sometimes the most important wars in history are fought with money long before they're fought with bullets. The first crack in the Union didn't appear on a battlefield. It appeared inside Congress, over a law that changed the American economy forever. History often tells us that America split apart in 1861. The truth is, America had already been drifting apart for decades. Not geographically, not politically, economically. From the outside, the United States looked like one growing republic stretching steadily westward. Its population was booming. Its borders were expanding. Its economy appeared stronger every year. Foreign investors admired its potential. Immigrants poured into its cities. Trade reached record levels. It looked like the success story of the 19th century. But beneath that remarkable growth, two completely different economies were evolving, and neither was moving in the same direction. In the North, change seemed unstoppable. Cities expanded almost faster than they could be built. Factories rose beside rivers and railroads. Steam engines transformed transportation. Banks financed new industries. Merchants invested in shipping companies. Entrepreneurs searched for faster machines and larger markets. Every innovation created another opportunity. Every opportunity attracted more investment. The cycle reinforced itself year after year. Prosperity came from production, from technology, from commerce, from constant expansion of industry. The South measured wealth very differently. Its prosperity rested almost entirely on the land. Vast plantations stretched across fertile countryside. Cotton dominated exports. Tobacco, rice, and sugar completed an agricultural empire that supplied markets around the world. The largest fortunes weren't built inside factories. They were built in cotton fields. And unlike northern industry, Southern agriculture depended on one resource above all others: enslaved labor. Without it, the entire plantation economy would begin to collapse. To Southern planters, enslaved workers weren't viewed merely as laborers. They represented productive capital. The larger the workforce, the larger the harvest. The larger the harvest, the greater the profits. More profits purchased more land. More land required more enslaved workers. The system constantly expanded upon itself. At first, these two economies appeared to complement one another. Southern plantations produced raw cotton. Northern merchants transported it. Northern banks financed the trade. Northern factories manufactured finished goods. Everyone seemed to benefit, or at least that's how it looked. In reality, each region wanted America to develop in completely opposite directions. Industrial states demanded protective tariffs to shield American factories from foreign competition. Agricultural states preferred unrestricted international trade that kept imported goods affordable and foreign markets open. Northern businessmen pushed for railroads linking cities, factories, and Western settlements. Southern leaders questioned why their tax dollars should finance projects that largely strengthen Northern commerce. Even the federal government became a source of growing suspicion. Every law seemed to favor one region more than the other. Every election raised new fears. Every compromise satisfied fewer people than the last. What looked like ordinary political disagreement was becoming something much more dangerous. Because every economic decision slowly shifted the balance of power. Neither side feared losing a single debate. They feared losing the future. And once survival becomes the goal, compromise becomes much harder than victory. By the late 1820s, the first major confrontation finally arrived. It wasn't over slavery directly. It wasn't over secession. It wasn't even over Abraham Lincoln. It began with a tax. A single law that convinced millions of Southerners the federal government had stopped representing them. Few Americans remember its official name today, but those who lived through it never forgot. They called it the Tariff of Abomination, and many believed it was the first warning that the Union itself was beginning to crack. When most people hear the word tariff, they think of taxes on imported goods. It sounds technical, boring even, certainly not something capable of tearing a nation apart. But in 1828, one piece of legislation did exactly that. Officially, it was known as the Tariff of 1,828. Its supporters called it economic protection. Its opponents gave it a far more memorable name, the Tariff of Abomination. That nickname alone tells you how deeply the country was divided. To understand why, you have to look at America through two completely different economic lenses. For manufacturers in the North, the tariff looked like a lifeline. British factories were flooding American markets with cheaper manufactured goods. Without protection, many young American industries struggled to compete. Higher import duties would make foreign products more expensive. Consumers would buy American-made goods instead. Factories would expand. Workers would find jobs. Industrial investment would accelerate. From the Northern perspective, the policy made perfect sense. It was designed to strengthen the nation's manufacturing base and reduce dependence on British industry. But the South saw something entirely different. Southern plantation owners sold most of their cotton overseas, especially to Great Britain. In return, they purchased British machinery, clothing, household goods, and industrial equipment. Every increase in import duties meant those products suddenly became far more expensive. The tariff didn't protect Southern wealth. It reduced it. Many plantation owners believed they were being forced to subsidize Northern industrial growth while receiving almost none of the benefit. Then came another fear, one that reached far beyond domestic politics. What if Britain retaliated? If British leaders responded by purchasing less American cotton or by imposing their own tariffs on Southern exports, the consequences could be devastating. Cotton wasn't simply another commodity. It was the foundation of the Southern economy. Any disruption to international trade threatened the fortunes of thousands of wealthy landowners. To many Southerners, the tariff no longer looked like economic policy. It looked like economic warfare. The debate quickly became emotional. Newspapers accused Congress of sacrificing one region to enrich another. Public meetings turned increasingly hostile. State politicians warned that Washington had begun abusing its constitutional authority. Leading this opposition was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Although he served as Vice President of the United States, Calhoun quietly developed a constitutional argument that challenged the very foundation of federal power. His theory became known as nullification. Its central claim was revolutionary. If a state believed a federal law violated the Constitution, that state had the right to declare the law invalid within its own borders. Today, the idea sounds almost impossible. In the early 19th century, it became one of the most explosive political theories in American history. South Carolina embraced the doctrine. By 1832, the state formally declared the federal tariffs null and void. It warned that if Washington attempted to enforce the law through military force, South Carolina would leave the Union. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 3 decades before Fort Sumter, nearly 3 decades before Confederate armies, an American state was already threatening secession. President Andrew Jackson responded with equal determination. He made it clear that federal law would be enforced, if necessary, with soldiers. For several tense months, the nation stood on the edge of armed conflict. Only a compromise engineered by Henry Clay prevented violence. The crisis ended, but something irreversible had happened. Americans had discovered that the Union could be challenged. Secession had moved from political theory to political possibility. And although the immediate dispute centered on tariffs, the deeper conflict had never been about taxes alone. Because beneath every economic argument stood the institution that shaped every Southern decision: slavery. The South wasn't just protecting its economy, it was protecting the single largest concentration of wealth in the United States. And that wealth wasn't measured in dollars alone. Today, slavery is remembered as one of the greatest moral crimes in human history. And rightly so. Millions of people were denied freedom. Families were torn apart. Lives were bought and sold as if human beings were nothing more than property. That truth should never be minimized. But if we stop there, we miss one of the most important reasons the United States became willing to fight a civil war. Because to the people making decisions in the 1850s, slavery wasn't viewed only as a labor system. It had become the foundation of an enormous financial machine. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved men, women, and children lived in the United States. Together, they represented an estimated $3.5 billion in property. That figure is almost impossible to imagine today. At the time, it exceeded the combined value of every railroad, every factory, every bank, every major industrial enterprise in America. No other asset came close. For wealthy plantation owners, enslaved people weren't simply workers. They were capital. The value of a plantation wasn't determined only by its land. It depended on the number of enslaved workers who could harvest cotton, tobacco, sugar, or rice. A larger workforce meant larger harvests. Larger harvests meant larger profits. And larger profits meant greater borrowing power. Banks eagerly accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. A plantation owner who wanted to purchase more land didn't always need cash. He could pledge human beings as security. Financial institutions viewed those assets as reliable because cotton prices remained strong and international demand continued growing. The cycle reinforced itself. Loans financed expansion. Expansion increased production. Higher production generated greater profits. Those profits supported even larger loans. It became a self-feeding financial system. Insurance companies joined the network as well. Policies were written to protect slaveholders against financial losses. Mortgage contracts listed enslaved families alongside land and buildings. Accounting records reduced lives to numbers on balance sheets. The language sounded cold, because it was. But the story doesn't end in the South. One of the greatest misconceptions about the antebellum economy is the belief that slavery existed in isolation. It didn't. Northern merchants handled cotton shipments leaving Southern ports. Wall Street financiers converted cotton profits into investment capital. Northern banks financed commercial transactions connected to plantation agriculture. Textile manufacturers depended on a steady flow of raw cotton. Across the Atlantic, British merchant houses extended credit to Southern businesses. Banks in London and Liverpool financed trade that linked American plantations to European factories. Manchester's textile mills consumed enormous quantities of cotton every year. Thousands of investors who never owned a plantation still earned profits from the slave economy. The system stretched across ocean. Plantations in Mississippi, banks in New York, shipping companies in Boston, investment firms in London, textile mills in Manchester, all became connected by one commodity, cotton. But cotton itself wasn't the true foundation. Enslaved labor was. Without it, the entire financial structure would begin to collapse. And that is precisely what terrified Southern leaders. To abolitionists, ending slavery represented a moral necessity. To many investors, bankers, and plantation owners, it threatened one of the largest concentrations of wealth the modern world had ever seen. Suddenly, every political debate carried enormous financial consequences. Congress wasn't simply debating policy anymore. It was debating the future of billions of dollars. And that future would soon depend on one question above all others. Could slavery continue expanding into the American West? The next battle wasn't about freeing enslaved people where slavery already existed. It was about deciding where slavery would exist tomorrow. And that question would push the nation closer to war than ever before. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had become obsessed with one idea: expansion. The nation kept growing. New territories stretched farther west. New settlers crossed rivers, mountains, and endless plains searching for land and opportunity. To ordinary Americans, westward expansion represented hope. A chance to start over. A chance to own property. a chance to build a better future. But in Washington, every new mile of land created a political crisis, because every territory would eventually become a state, and every new state meant new senators, new representatives, new electoral vote. Whoever controlled the West would eventually control the country. That reality terrified both North and South. For decades, Congress had managed this fragile balance through compromise. The most famous was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It wasn't a perfect solution. In fact, many people considered it morally indefensible. But politically, it achieved something extremely important. It bought time. By drawing an invisible line across the Louisiana Purchase, Congress attempted to separate future free territories from future slave territories. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state. Maine entered as a free state. Neither side completely lost. For more than 30 years, that balance kept the Senate from falling entirely into the hands of either region. And that balance mattered enormously. The Senate wasn't simply another legislative chamber. It was the institution capable of protecting or destroying Southern political power. As long as free states and slave states remained nearly equal, Southern politicians could block legislation they considered dangerous. Higher tariffs, greater federal authority, infrastructure projects favoring Northern industry, or, most importantly, any attempt to interfere with slavery itself. The system survived because neither side believed it had been permanently defeated. But demographics were changing. Every year, more settlers moved west. Every year, new territories requested organization. Every year, Congress faced the same impossible question: free or slave? It wasn't really a question about geography. It was a question about the future balance of power. Southern leaders understood something many modern observers overlook. If slavery stopped expanding, its political influence would slowly begin to disappear. Population growth favored the North. Immigration overwhelmingly benefited Northern states. Industrial cities expanded rapidly. Without new slave states entering the Union, the South would eventually lose its equal footing in Congress. And once that happened, every protection it relied upon could disappear. Northern politicians saw exactly the opposite danger. If slavery expanded into every new Western territory, the plantation economy would continue spreading across the continent. The South would strengthen its position inside Congress. The balance that had protected free labor states for decades would vanish. Each side believed it was defending the future of America. Each believed the other threatened that future. As new territories continued appearing, compromise became harder. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to calm tensions once again. California entered the Union as a free state. Meanwhile, the territories of New Mexico and Utah would decide the slavery question later through popular sovereignty. For a brief moment, politicians congratulated themselves. Once again, they believed they had saved the Union, but they hadn't solved the problem. They had simply postponed it. Because compromise works only when both sides believe tomorrow will still be fair. By the early 1850s, that confidence had almost completely disappeared. Then one ambitious senator proposed a law that destroyed the last political agreement keeping the nation together. And once Congress approved it, the road to war became dramatically shorter. The law was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Within months, Americans weren't debating slavery anymore. They were killing each other over it. For more than 30 years, the Missouri Compromise had done one important job. It kept the peace. Not because it solved America's greatest problem, but because it convinced both North and South that the political system could still manage it. That illusion ended in 1854. The man responsible wasn't trying to start a civil war. He was trying to build a railroad. Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas envisioned a transcontinental railway stretching from Chicago to the Pacific Ocean. It would transform trade, strengthen the economy, and place Chicago at the center of America's future. But before construction could begin, Congress had to organize the vast Nebraska territory. Douglas needed Southern votes. Southern senators wanted something in return. The bargain they reached would change American history. Douglas proposed repealing one of the country's oldest political agreements. Instead of honoring the Missouri Compromise, settlers living in Kansas and Nebraska would decide for themselves whether slavery would be permitted. The principle sounded democratic. It became known as popular sovereignty. Let the people vote. Let local communities choose. No one in Congress fully appreciated what those simple words would unleash, because Kansas and Nebraska both lay north of the Missouri Compromise line. For more than 3 decades, Americans had assumed slavery would never expand there. Now that guarantee disappeared overnight. The reaction in the North was explosive. Newspapers condemned the legislation. Mass meetings filled town halls. Political leaders accused Congress of surrendering the future of the West. One of the country's oldest political parties, the Whigs, began collapsing under the pressure. Out of that collapse emerged an entirely new movement. The Republican Party, contrary to popular belief, its earliest members were not united around immediate abolition. Their first objective was much narrower: stop slavery from expanding into the Western territories, nothing more, nothing less. Even Abraham Lincoln embraced that position. He believed slavery was morally wrong. But he also believed the Constitution offered no clear authority to abolish it where it already existed. Instead, he argued that if slavery could be prevented from spreading westward, it would gradually lose the political strength needed to dominate the nation. Southern leaders interpreted that strategy very differently. To them, containment meant eventual destruction. Cotton plantations exhausted fertile soil year after year. Successful plantation agriculture required constant expansion. Fresh land meant continued profits. Without access to Western territory, the plantation economy would slowly suffocate. The issue was no longer simply economic. It became existential. Each side concluded that its future depended on controlling the same land. Compromise became almost impossible. As settlers rushed into Kansas, neither side intended to lose. Pro-slavery supporters crossed the border from Missouri, hoping to influence election. Anti-slavery settlers arrived from northern states with exactly the same goal. Political campaigns quickly gave way to intimidation. Intimidation soon became violence. What Congress had described as popular sovereignty was rapidly becoming something far darker. Instead of letting democracy decide the future, Americans were preparing to settle the question with rifles. Kansas would become the first place where neighbors killed neighbors over the future of slavery. And once blood began to flow, there would be no easy path back to peace. History remembers Fort Sumter as the beginning of the Civil War. But many Americans had already witnessed the first battles years earlier, on the plains of Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act promised that ordinary citizens would decide the future of slavery through elections. Instead, it turned Kansas into a battlefield. People from both sides rushed into the territory for one reason: to control the vote. Pro-slavery settlers crossed the border from Missouri in large numbers. Many weren't moving there permanently. They came to influence election. Some intimidated voters. Others stuffed ballot boxes. To them, every election was another chance to protect the future of the South. The North answered immediately. Anti-slavery organizations raised money to help families relocate to Kansas. Entire wagon trains traveled west, carrying settlers determined to make Kansas a free state. Suddenly, thousands of strangers arrived with completely different visions for the same land. Neither side intended to compromise. Each believed the future of the republic depended on victory. Soon, 2 rival governments claimed authority over Kansas. Each insisted it represented the legitimate will of the people. Each accused the other of fraud. Political speeches became threats. Threats became shootings. Shootings became organized violence. The newspapers gave the conflict a name that perfectly captured the chaos: Bleeding Kansas. It wasn't officially called a civil war, but in many ways, that's exactly what it had become. Homes were burned. Businesses were destroyed. Armed militias patrolled roads that had only recently welcomed new settlers. Neighbors no longer argued across meeting halls. They pointed rifles at one another. Then came one of the darkest moments of the crisis. In May 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the town of Lawrence, a center of anti-slavery activism. Printing presses were smashed. Buildings were burned. Homes were looted. The attack sent shockwaves across the North. Many Americans concluded that peaceful politics had failed. Only days later, the violence escalated even further. An abolitionist named John Brown decided retaliation was no longer enough. He believed slavery could only be destroyed through force. Leading a small band of followers, Brown entered the settlement near Pottawatomie Creek. During the night, they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes. All 5 were killed. The murders horrified the nation. To many Northerners, Brown represented a desperate man responding to an evil system. To many Southerners, he became proof that abolitionists were willing to embrace terrorism. Fear spread across both regions. Each side now believed the other had abandoned law altogether. Kansas continued descending into violence. But while armed settlers fought on the frontier, another battle unfolded inside the nation's highest court. In 1857, the Supreme Court announced its decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. The ruling stunned the country. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens under the Constitution. Then came an even more explosive conclusion. Congress, the court ruled, had no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the federal territories. The decision struck at the heart of the Republican platform. If Congress couldn't restrict slavery's expansion, what political solution remained? For many Northerners, faith in the legal system began collapsing. If courts couldn't stop slavery, perhaps elections wouldn't either. And if elections failed, what remained besides force? That terrifying question became even more urgent in October 1859. John Brown appeared once again. This time, he wasn't targeting a small settlement. He attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His plan was astonishingly ambitious. Capture thousands of weapons, arm enslaved people throughout the South, trigger the largest slave uprising in American history. The raid failed. Brown was captured by U.S. Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. But Brown's execution accomplished something neither side expected. It transformed him into a symbol. In much of the North, church bells rang in his honor. Writers praised his courage. Some ministers compared him to a martyr. In the South, those celebrations produced fear unlike anything before. If Northerners celebrated a man who tried to ignite a slave rebellion, what would happen next? By the end of 1859, trust had almost completely disappeared. One final political event was all it would take to push the nation over the edge. In November de Lapendresse and Nampula, Americans went to the polls. Within weeks, the United States began falling apart. By 1860, the United States wasn't simply divided, it was exhausted. For more than 30 years, Congress had negotiated one compromise after another. Each agreement bought a little more time. None solved the problem. Every election became more bitter. Every debate grew more personal. Every new state reignited the same question. How long could one nation survive while moving in two completely different directions? Then came the presidential election. Abraham Lincoln was not the most experienced politician in the race. He wasn't even a candidate many Southerners took seriously at first, but his campaign represented something entirely new. For the first time, a major political party had built its national platform around preventing slavery from expanding into the Western territories. Lincoln didn't promise immediate abolition. He repeatedly stated that he had no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery where it already existed. His goal was containment, nothing more. Yet to Southern leaders, containment was enough, because they understood what many people in the North did not. If slavery stopped expanding, its political influence would slowly disappear. The North's population was growing much faster. Immigration overwhelmingly favored northern cities. Every census shifted representation in Congress. Every future free state would strengthen northern political control. Even without abolishing slavery immediately, the South could already see where the country was heading. Lincoln's victory confirmed their worst fears. Perhaps the most remarkable fact about the election wasn't how many votes Lincoln received. It was where he received them. He won almost entirely with Northern support. In 10 Southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. To millions of Southerners, that fact carried enormous symbolic weight. For the first time, a president had been elected without needing meaningful Southern political support. The message seemed unmistakable. The North no longer needed the South to govern the nation. If that trend continued, Southern influence inside the federal government would shrink year after year. Many believed they faced a simple choice: leave while they still possessed enough power to negotiate, or remain until they became permanently outnumbered. South Carolina chose first. On the 20th of December 1860, the state officially voted to leave the Union. Within weeks, Mississippi followed, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. One after another, states announced that they were no longer part of the United States. By February 1861, they had created a new government, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis became its president. For years afterward, many defenders of the Confederacy argued that secession had been fought primarily over the principle of states' rights. But the historical record tells a more direct story. The official declarations issued by the seceding states repeatedly identified slavery as the central issue. Mississippi declared that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Georgia described repeated disputes over slavery in the territories. South Carolina condemned Northern resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. Texas complained that slave property was no longer adequately protected. These weren't vague references hidden between legal language. They appeared openly. Repeatedly, the Confederacy's own leaders explained exactly what they believed they were defending. Then, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens made that position even clearer. In his famous Cornerstone speech, Stephens argued that the new Confederate government rested upon the belief that racial inequality and slavery formed its natural foundation, whether people agreed with him or not. His words removed any uncertainty. The Confederacy wasn't simply separating over constitutional theory. It was defending an entire political, economic, and social order built upon slavery. Yet even then, the conflict reached beyond America's borders, because as the South prepared for war, Europe watched closely, and Southern leaders believed they possessed one weapon powerful enough to force Britain into the conflict: cotton. The Confederacy believed the world needed Southern cotton too much to let it lose. It was a gamble called King Cotton, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed brilliant. When the Southern states left the Union, they believed they possessed something more powerful than a larger army, more powerful than a stronger navy, even more powerful than the federal government itself. They believed they controlled the world's most valuable commodity, cotton. For decades, cotton had become the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Textile mills across Britain consumed enormous quantities every year. Factories in Manchester, Liverpool, and Lancashire transformed raw Southern cotton into cloth that reached markets around the globe. Millions of jobs depended on that supply. Ships crossed the Atlantic almost continuously. Merchants became wealthy. Banks financed trade. Insurance companies protected cargo. Entire industries revolved around one agricultural product grown thousands of miles away. The Confederate leadership believed this dependency created an extraordinary opportunity. If Europe needed Southern cotton badly enough, then Europe would eventually need the Confederacy. The strategy became known as King Cotton diplomacy. Its logic appeared almost impossible to challenge. Stop exporting cotton, force British factories to shut down, throw thousands of workers out of their jobs, create enough economic pressure that Britain and France would recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. Perhaps they would even break the Union blockade by force. If that happened, Southern independence might become inevitable. At first, events seemed to support that belief. As the Union Navy tightened its blockade around Southern ports, cotton shipments collapsed. Factories across Lancashire struggled to find raw materials. Production slowed dramatically. Many mills closed their doors. Workers lost their income. Entire communities experienced severe hardship. British newspapers filled with stories about unemployment and economic suffering. Southern leaders watched these developments with growing optimism. Surely Britain couldn't allow its own industries to collapse. Surely the government would intervene. But the Confederacy underestimated two critical realities. The first was preparation. Before the war, British merchants had accumulated large cotton reserves. Those stockpiles softened the immediate impact of the blockade. More importantly, Britain began searching for new suppliers. Cotton production expanded rapidly in India, Egypt, and Brazil. The transition wasn't easy. The quality often differed. Transportation remained difficult, but it proved something the Confederacy had refused to believe. The world could adapt. The second reality proved even more decisive: public opinion. Britain had abolished slavery throughout most of its empire decades earlier. Many ordinary workers who suffered during the cotton famine still refused to support a government fighting to preserve slavery. Despite unemployment, despite hunger, many British laborers openly expressed sympathy for the Union. Then Abraham Lincoln fundamentally changed the diplomatic landscape. On the 1st of January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Although its immediate legal effect was limited to areas controlled by the Confederacy, its political impact reached far beyond the battlefield. The war could no longer be described simply as a struggle over secession. Now it carried an unmistakable moral dimension. If Britain officially recognized the Confederacy after emancipation became a declared Union objective, it would appear to the world as though Britain had chosen slavery over freedom. That was a political cost few leaders were willing to accept. There were also strategic concerns. British officials knew that direct intervention could spark war with the Union. Canada might become vulnerable. Atlantic trade could be disrupted. Food imports from northern states might be threatened. Supporting the Confederacy suddenly looked far riskier than remaining neutral. France showed greater interest. Emperor Napoleon III considered intervention more seriously than many British politicians. But without Britain's cooperation, France had little chance of acting alone. Gradually, the Confederacy's greatest diplomatic strategy unraveled. King Cotton had failed. The South had believed the world needed its cotton more than it opposed slavery. Instead, the world adjusted. Alternative suppliers emerged. Public opinion shifted. Diplomatic support disappeared. From that moment forward, the Confederacy faced the Union alone. Yet while Europe debated diplomacy, Lincoln confronted an equally dangerous challenge at home, because preserving the Union required him to balance military necessity, political survival, and one of the greatest moral questions in American history. Lincoln wanted to destroy slavery, but if he moved too quickly, he risked losing the very war that made emancipation possible. History tends to simplify great leaders. Over time, complicated decisions become simple stories. Abraham Lincoln is often remembered as the president who freed the slaves. That is true, but the road to that decision was far more difficult than most people realize. When Lincoln entered the White House in March 1861, he inherited a nation that was already falling apart. 7 southern states had left the Union. Federal forts were isolated. Government authority was collapsing across much of the South. Every decision carried enormous risks. One mistake could push even more states into the Confederacy. And 4 states mattered more than all the others: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. These border states still allowed slavery, yet they remained inside the Union. Their loyalty wasn't guaranteed. Maryland surrounded Washington, D.C. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, the nation's capital would be nearly impossible to defend. Kentucky controlled vital rivers and transportation routes linking the Midwest to the South. Missouri guarded access to the western frontier. Losing those states would dramatically strengthen the Confederacy before the war had truly begun. Lincoln understood this better than anyone. That is why, during the first months of the war, he spoke far more about preserving the Union than abolishing slavery. To many modern readers, that sounds contradictory. How could a war caused by slavery not immediately become a war against slavery? Because Lincoln wasn't speaking only to abolitionists. He was speaking to millions of uncertain Americans whose support remained absolutely essential. Every speech was carefully measured. Every public statement carried military consequences. He couldn't afford to alienate loyal slave states. Even some Northern Democrats warned that making emancipation an official war goal too early would fracture the Union coalition. Then, events began testing Lincoln's strategy. In 1861, General John C. Fremont declared the freedom of enslaved people owned by Confederate supporters in Missouri. Many abolitionists celebrated. Lincoln quietly revoked the order, not because he rejected emancipation, but because he feared Kentucky might leave the Union. Months later, General David Hunter issued another emancipation order covering parts of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Once again, Lincoln canceled it. His critics accused him of hesitation. Others claimed he lacked moral courage. Lincoln accepted the criticism because he believed losing the border states would make ending slavery impossible. Without military victory, there would be no emancipation, no constitutional amendment, no permanent change. As the war continued, circumstances shifted dramatically. The conflict became longer and bloodier than anyone expected. Thousands of enslaved people escaped to Union line. Military commanders increasingly recognized that slavery sustained the Confederate economy. Destroying slavery would weaken Southern agriculture, transportation, and logistics. It would also strengthen the Union. Then came one of the defining moments in American history. On the 1st of January 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Legally, its immediate reach was limited. It applied only to territories still under Confederate control. Lincoln couldn't instantly free enslaved people in places the Union did not yet govern. Yet politically, the proclamation transformed the war forever. It made slavery impossible to separate from Union victory. It discouraged Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. It encouraged thousands of formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 African American soldiers had served in Union uniform. Their contribution became indispensable. Lincoln's balancing act had succeeded. He had preserved the border states, maintained the Union coalition, and eventually turned emancipation into both a moral objective and a military strategy. But even as Union armies advanced, a larger question remained unanswered. Had the Civil War become inevitable long before Lincoln ever took office? Or had America simply ignored too many warnings for too many years? The deeper historians look at the decades before 1861, the harder it becomes to believe the war could have been avoided at all. By the final years before the Civil War, the United States had reached a point where every political victory became someone else's existential defeat. That is what made compromise so difficult. Neither side believed it was simply negotiating another piece of legislation. Each believed it was fighting for survival. The North and the South weren't arguing over a single issue. They were defending two completely different economic futures. The North imagined a nation powered by industry. Factories, railroads, banks, immigration, innovation. Its leaders believed America's future depended on manufacturing, expanding cities, and a growing national market connected by transportation and finance. The South envisioned something very different. Its wealth flowed from fertile land, cotton exports, international trade, and a plantation system built upon enslaved labor. For Southern elites, slavery wasn't simply an institution. It was the engine that kept the entire economy moving. Without it, plantations lost value. Banks lost collateral. Merchants lost business. Governments lost tax revenue. Political influence weakened. Everything connected to everything else. That was the tragedy. The debate had moved far beyond morality. It had become structural. Every proposal in Congress exposed the same underlying conflict. Higher tariffs favored industrial states. Lower tariffs favored agricultural exporters. Federal investment in railroads strengthened northern commerce. Limited government protected local southern control. A stronger national banking system accelerated industrial expansion. Decentralized finance preserved regional independence. Every disagreement appeared different, yet every road eventually led back to the same destination. Slavery. Because slavery determined labor. Labor determined production. Production determined wealth. Wealth determined political power. And political power determined the future of the Republic. By the late 1850s, the machinery driving the conflict had become almost impossible to stop. The Missouri Compromise had delayed it. The Compromise of 1850 delayed it again. The Kansas-Nebraska Act accelerated it. Bleeding Kansas proved political violence had already begun. The Dred Scott decision shattered confidence in the courts. John Brown's raid destroyed what little trust remained between North and South. Lincoln's election simply exposed a crisis that had been building for generations. The war wasn't created in 1861. It was revealed in 1861. Once fighting began, the North possessed advantages that grew stronger every year. Its population was more than twice as large. Its factories produced most of the nation's weapons. Its railroads moved soldiers and supplies with remarkable speed. Its banks financed an industrial war economy capable of replacing losses. The South fought with determination. Its commanders won brilliant victory. Its soldiers displayed extraordinary courage. But courage alone could not replace locomotives, or factories, or steel mill, or financial institutions capable of sustaining a long war. As months turned into years, the balance shifted steadily toward the Union. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy could no longer continue. Richmond fell. General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The bloodiest conflict in American history finally came to an end. Months later, the 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. With a single constitutional amendment, America's largest financial asset disappeared forever. No government compensation, no gradual transition, no negotiated settlement. An entire economic system ended through military defeat. The Civil War had not only preserved the Union, it had fundamentally transformed the American economy, the Constitution, and the balance of power between the states and the federal government. But victory would not erase the consequences of nearly 80 years of division. In many ways, the nation's hardest struggle was only beginning. The war ended in 1865. But the questions it raised about freedom, equality, wealth, and power have never truly disappeared. And perhaps they never will. History often remembers the American Civil War as the conflict that ended slavery. That is true. But it also did something much larger. It changed the direction of an entire nation. When the fighting finally stopped in 1865, more than 620,000 Americans had lost their lives. Entire communities had been devastated. Railroads were destroyed. Cities lay in ruins. Plantations that had once generated unimaginable wealth stood abandoned. The economic cost was staggering. The human cost was beyond calculation. Yet the war's greatest impact wasn't measured by the destruction it left behind. It was measured by the country that emerged afterward. For nearly a century, Americans had debated whether the United States was a loose partnership of sovereign states, or one nation governed by a single federal authority. The Civil War answered that question forever. The Union survived. Secession failed. Federal authority emerged stronger than it had ever been before. That political transformation reshaped everything. With Southern opposition removed from Congress, legislation that had been blocked for decades suddenly moved forward. The Homestead Act accelerated settlement across the West. The Pacific Railroad Acts connected the continent with a transcontinental railroad. The National Banking Acts created a stronger financial system. Land-grant universities expanded education and scientific research across the country. Together, these changes laid the foundation for America's rise as an industrial and economic superpower during the late 19th century. But history is never as simple as victory and defeat. The abolition of slavery ended one of the darkest institutions in American history. It did not end the struggle for equality. Millions of newly freed African Americans entered a society that still denied them equal opportunity. Reconstruction offered hope, yet many of its promises were gradually dismantled. Systems of segregation, racial violence, discriminatory laws, and economic inequality replaced slavery in new forms. Freedom had been won. Justice remained unfinished. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. The Civil War wasn't inevitable because Americans lacked intelligence, or courage, or leadership. It became inevitable because political compromise could no longer reconcile two economic systems built upon completely different foundations. One depended on free labor, the other depended on human bondage. Eventually, one had to give way. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on battles, generals, and famous speeches. But beneath those dramatic moments lay something much deeper. Money, power, economic incentives, political institutions, and decisions made over decades by people who believed they were protecting their own future. History rarely changes because of one event. It changes because countless small choices accumulate until they become impossible to reverse. That is why the Civil War still matters. Not only because it explains America's past, but because it reminds us how fragile every nation becomes when economic interests, political institutions, and moral principles drift too far apart. Maybe the greatest warning history offers isn't that conflict happens suddenly. It's that societies often recognize the danger only after the point of no return has already passed. So here's a question worth thinking about. If you had been living in America during the 1850s, would you have believed the Union could still be saved peacefully? Or would you have seen the warning signs long before the first cannon fired at Fort Sumter? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy thoughtful documentaries that go beyond the textbook, exploring the hidden economic, political, and historical forces that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next deep dive. Because the most fascinating stories in history are often the ones we've only begun to understand.